Hello, and welcome to the second episode of Solutions. I'm Grant,
And I'm Elias.
and today we're going to be talking about misinformation and the subsequent rejection of reality that we tend to see. So, this is going to cover more serious topics like climate denialism and COVID denialism, as well as claims about election fraud that led to the assault on the Capitol January 6th. Not necessarily specifically looking to into all of these claims and how they come about, but sort of looking at it systemically. What kinds of people propagate these lies? Why are they believed by so many different people when sometimes they're so obviously false? And what can we do about this? So, this episode, we have decided to deviate from our typical structure. Last episode, we did all of our research on our own, and then we hopped into the first episode. You know, very little corroboration between Elias and I. This time, we still did most of our research separate, but we collaborated a little bit. We shared some of our sources and articles with each other, but we're still trying to maintain two different perspectives on this. If you guys have any input for us about how we can improve, we're on Facebook, Instagram, and Reddit. Elias just created the new Discord. And then, as always, we'll have an article on medium.com/solutions where we're going to have everything that we talk about here, all of the sources written out in an article. So that way you guys can read that when this episode goes up.
So we figured we'd start this out by going over what exactly constitutes misinformation. And the reason it's good to kind of like get this out of the way is because I noticed when talking to a lot of people about this topic that a lot of people kind of have their doubts about the entire concept. What is truth? What is reality? And specifically when you get into the deeper, more political subjects, who gets to decide what is misinformation and what isn't, right? This is a huge concern that people have had really ever since these topics started becoming well known. So we want to use the strictest definition possible of misinformation. And so basically, when we look at separating truth from falsehoods, we want to look at where there's evidence and we want to look at where there is rational thought that can be put together to back up particular claims. And so when we look at these claims, we want to look at, okay, well, what is the most up-to-date information? What is the best way we have of, arriving at our conclusions? And the best way that we typically go about this is through fact checkers. They're sort of the most useful tool that we have at our disposal right now for separating truth from falsehoods, because these are the organizations that have been doing it for a very long time. But of course, you have all of the same potential problems with fact checkers as you do with any other publication, which is, is there bias coming in? Are the people working there and publishing these articles opinionated in certain ways? And the answer is yes and no. We actually looked at a few different analyses of this. And so one study published in the Journal of Political Marketing, this was sort of one of the first one that did a good cross-examination of a lot of these, was it looked at three fact checkers, PolitiFact, FactCheck.org, and Washington Post fact checker. And it found that when they all analyze the same claim, they tend to overwhelmingly agree on whether it's true or false. But the interesting thing about this is that it gets a little bit more nuanced when you look at the different scales of ratings. So like true, mostly true, half true, this sort of thing. And so a subsequent paper by Chloe Lim, PhD student at Stanford University. And the other thing is that they often don't look at the same statements, and so that's where some of the disparity comes in. So it's both of those things. But sort of the headline of this was that there were very little overlap in the statements that fact checkers look at. So this looked at PolitiFact and fact checker, and out of the 1,065 fact checks that PolitiFact looked at and the 240 fact checks that Washington Post looked at, only 70 statements were fact checked by both of them. And the study found that of the 70 statements, the fact checkers gave consistent ratings for 49 of them, so 47%, which means that one out of every 5 times, the two fact checkers disagreed on the accuracy of those statements. And so a lot of the nuance came in where, like I said, you had the different, breakdowns of mostly true and that sort of thing. And it found that these were often, 1 point off from one to the other.
Right. So, and then the question becomes, if fact checkers are human and can be biased, why should we look at them for information? Well, kind of as Elias mentioned, they tend to agree quite a bit of the time, at least, to some degree or another. But another reason why you should look at fact checkers is because they can be a great way for you to sort of inform your own analysis. Oftentimes, well, pretty much all the time, with any sort of fact check, they have sort of their reasoning with sources listed at the bottom. PolitiFact doesn't, have a link that you click on that just says, X statement is true or X statement is false. They provide their reasoning. And so you can check all the sources and search through the reasoning and determine which of those sources you think are valid. Obviously you want to be as impartial as you can and sort of removing your own cognitive bias from that analysis. But as long as you're engaging with the sources in good faith, I think that that's a pretty good way to make sure that you're sort of checking the fact checkers. Another thing to consider is that if fact checkers can't be trusted, then who can we trust? Because every media outlet is going to have profit motives and biases. They're going to be more or less uh, playing to some demographic. And, if you just go by your own intuition, that definitely leads to a subjective cognitive bias. So fact checkers, at least in our opinion, are the have the least incentive to lie. And then something else to think about is if something like PolitiFact or Snopes or any of these organizations were outright lying or regularly spreading misinformation, there would be consequences for those platforms, or for those organizations rather. So there's already a demand for some of these organizations to be like debunked. Many people tend to reject the fact checks done by Snopes because oftentimes Snopes fact checks disagree with them. Well, if there's a market for that debunk to be met, then why isn't it met? Why hasn't somebody created a fact checking organization that can match tit for tat some organization like PolitiFact or Snopes? And then also there could be legal repercussions for an organization consistently and erroneously claiming that others are spreading misinformation, because then that could lead to defamation and slander.
Yes. So that's sort of the thought process behind looking up information online and verifying it and not necessarily trusting fact checkers, but looking to fact checkers for up to date info, looking at, what information they're providing and sort of taking your analysis from there. So moving on. Um, we know that misinformation is rampant on social media, especially, but also all over the internet. And so it's worth sort of before we get into a lot of the solutions and analyses that we have, just sort of like taking a minute to look at some of the more prominent examples of historical misinformation and who's pushing it out there, so that we can know how exactly to target it and circumvent it.
Right. So, what we want to do at this point is sort of examine the large institutions that want to manipulate the population for economic or personal gain. And what I think is a really good way to look at this is to look at starting with a company like ExxonMobil. And I'm referring to a Scientific American article, and then which was reporting on a report by Inside Climate News, where they determined that corporate documents showed that Exxon was fully aware of the effects of burning fossil fuels as early as 1977, yet did not disclose this to the public at the time. As we know, rising CO2 emissions can lead to rising global temperatures, and that's, climate change. It's a very big problem. And they were aware of this problem, yet didn't disclose this. As climate change became more and more a topic of discussion, not only in scientific circles, but just political circles in general, because of the consequences of it, they created the Global Climate Coalition in 1989, which worked to undermine the scientific basis for climate change concern. Which the motive behind this is to delay any sort of regulation that may affect their profits. According to Greenpeace, you can sort of take or leave that source as you will. I know a lot of people find it contentious, But ExxonMobil has spent approximately 30 million on think tanks that promote climate change denialism, despite that they were aware of the effects of rising temperatures being linked to rising CO2 levels. So how do these think tanks operate, and how does this misinformation sort of spread in a rhetorical fashion? Well, it can be done in a number of ways. Promoting logical fallacies. Oftentimes, you'll hear people say, "Well, if climate change is real, why is it cold in X region or during X time of year?" Or, "Well, the climate changed prior. We had the ice age, so maybe the climate's just changing again." Both of these obfuscate a lot of the scientific realities of climate change. The former of different seasons being cold doesn't take into account the overall yearly averages of rising temperatures, and the latter not accounting for the sharp increase in CO2 emissions, much sharper than what we saw during other heating periods. And then promoting fake experts is another method. An internet petition that was circling around was 31,000 experts who disputed the idea that man made climate change was a serious problem, or that man was responsible for climate change. Was being propagated. And then, after further investigation, 99% of these experts had no expertise in climatology. They had varying different areas of expertise, but not necessarily to the subject.
Yeah, that's a huge one. A lot of I've seen a lot on social media of like articles and things like that from these various blogs and websites that will claim like, "Oh, well this expert says, something against the scientific consensus and insert whatever here." And so, well, look, this is what the experts are saying, and or they'll try to do a proof by numbers like, clearly, this internet petition had 31,000 experts. Can you really disagree with 31,000 people? Or they'll post a huge dump of like a 100 different peer reviewed studies that say you know one various thing. And oftentimes if you look at it, you can't just look at it at face value and say, oh well, x number of people or x number of studies said this. A lot of times when you dig into each individual thing, you find out that it's taken out of context, or like, in this example, like you said, that a lot of these experts had no expertise in climatology, so it was not really relevant whatever they were experts in, right? So it's really important to be on the lookout for stuff like that that sounds official, but it's made to sort of misinform people.
Right. It's definitely good to look at the minutia of whatever claim is being made, especially in the face of that. I think at this point, the idea that humans are causing climate change and that climate change is a serious issue shouldn't really be up for debate, given the amount of academic consensus there is. There are quite a few meta analyses that take into account many different studies that all kind of arrive at the same conclusion. So a lot of these tactics of either, misrepresenting the science or providing false experts or cherry picking data, um, this a lot of this originated from the tobacco industry. The tobacco industry, famously promoting misinformation about smoking not being toxic or harmful, or that they were, you know, um, selling cigarettes that would put less tar in your lungs, sort of again to stall regulation that would affect their profits. So, top CEOs of tobacco companies were aware of the bad press that was coming their way around the 1950s, and they created their own research committee. I'm referring to an Atlantic article that sources heavily on a Center of Public Integrity article that we'll be delving into later a little bit here. But they created their own committee to hire independent scientists that would argue sort of on their behalf to dismiss claims about association with cancer and other illnesses that come from smoking tobacco. However, it was as clear as 1964 when the Surgeon General put out a report linking smoking to lung cancer. Despite this, the tobacco industry spent tons of money to spread a misinformation and fought tooth and nail for against any kind of regulation. Later, around the 90s or so, and then going forward, companies like Philip Morris hired firms like Gradient Corp or Rambo Environ, where these firms, the scientists that belong to them, argue that chemical products aren't harmful in, a certain capacity, or that these claims of harm are greatly overstated. Anything that they can do to sort of stall the regulatory process that would affect their profits. So, looking at Gradient Corp for an example, um, this is a company that its biggest clients are the American Petroleum Institute, Navistar, which is a diesel truck manufacturer, and then other chemical and industrial chemical producers. So the big problem with something like Gradient Corp is that it stalls regulation. Well, how does it do this? So, to understand, there are 80,000 chemicals that are available on the market. And over the past 30 years to about 2016, the EPA has reviewed about 570. So the EPA has to review any chemical before passing any regulation on that chemical. This is where Gradient Corp comes in. They, on behalf of their clients, industry that produces chemicals, will argue the efficacy of how the EPA is reviewing the scientific literature, or they will publish their own literature in journals like Critical Reviews in Toxicology and Regulatory Toxicology and Pharmacology, which is a scientific journal which is peer reviewed but heavily funded by a lot of these industries that are affected by these kinds of regulations. So, for example, if we look at the regulations on arsenic that were going to be put in around 2013 or so, the EPA had determined that high consumption of arsenic led to higher rates of bladder cancer and lung cancer. Essentially, what is done here is that companies like Gradient Corp, on behalf of tobacco chemical producers, sort of create this tactic of stalling regulation by fighting tooth and nail, questioning the efficacy of science that finds that whatever product might be toxic. The goal is to keep profits going at the expense of those that might be negatively affected by that product. And they rely on, our regulatory bodies not being well funded enough to be able to review all of the claims that, Gradient Corp makes, for example, with the arsenic regulations.
Okay, so if corporations have for decades been this good, possibly even longer, at sort of manipulating government agencies and pushing out their own firms that do this biased research and things like that, it seems like kind of a huge thing that the common people are up against. So what would be some paths to solving this problem, do you think?
In my opinion, I think some of the solutions that we would advocate for would be providing more funding to regulatory agencies like the EPA, so that way that they, one, can contend the science better and, not have as much of a monkey wrench thrown in their analysis and review of products that they want to put regulations on, but also allowing agencies like the EPA to engage in legislation to hold these corporate interests accountable. So, another thing that we're going to want to do is look at who funds what studies. Obviously, conflict of interest is huge. If you have private industry supporting a journal like the one I mentioned earlier, the Critical Reviews in Toxicology, don't dismiss these studies outright. However, look into what they're saying and take it with several grains of salt, because obviously they're going to have a motive to represent their benefactors as well as possible.
Yeah, and a lot of times there's a lot of like almost like lying by omission sometimes with some of these studies where they'll like it's sort of like the same thing in a lot of, more sketchy like journalism sites where they'll focus on certain aspects and ignore other aspects. So you just kind of have to like look at the bigger picture and look at who's trying to refute certain things and always look for evidence that kind of contradicts your own like preconceived narrative as well. It is kind of a scary issue when you think about all of the scientific peer-reviewed research that's out there, and obviously a lot of this stuff is very well researched and unbiased, but a lot of it is selective, and so it's always just important to look at everything with a critical eye, and not a critical eye as in like, oh, this doesn't fit what I believe, so I don't trust it, but just looking at everything really closely. So, besides large corporations, we're going to go over kind of a lot of different types of groups of people that spread misinformation, just to show how widespread it really is. But sort of the next one we wanted to go over was websites that are, independent media, independent blogs, and things like that, and how we don't often think about the profit motive potentially that there might be behind them, but um, but sometimes there is one, even when they're claiming that they're giving us unbiased information. And so the most obvious example of this that pretty much everyone should be able to point to at this point is natural news. And so if anyone's not familiar, they were sort of a infamous, notorious alternative medicine blog that pushed a lot of conspiracy theories about how Western medicine is all corrupted by big pharma, and it's interesting because a lot of people believed them at one point. They've kind of been thoroughly debunked a lot, so not a lot of people follow them anymore, I don't think. But it's interesting looking at sort of their history because there were a lot of signs right from the start. So, for example, and this was just a quick and easy tidbit that you can find anywhere. The founder of this website, Michael Allen Adams, sort of promoted himself as someone who was pushing these products from a truly independent perspective. That's a quote from him. And that was their whole thing, is that like, oh, we're the unbiased people. Look at us for like, true unbiased news. We're not bought out by anyone, that sort of thing. And then it turned out that he had a financial interest in one of the companies that he was pushing.
One of the common trends that we're seeing between what you're talking about with natural news and sort of what I was discussing earlier with Gradient Corp, tobacco, and companies like ExxonMobil is that there is oftentimes a financial incentive for people to lie. And if, they can spread misinformation basically for money, as in the misinformation allows them to either make money or stop things that would harm their ability to make money, then they're going to have that motive to spread that misinformation. So it's always good to try to follow the money and see the financial interests, if you can, of whoever is propagating any information, whether it's true or false. This isn't to say that 100% of people who have a financial interest in something are always going to lie about that, but you should always be careful and vigilant about that sort of thing.
Yeah, and that's sort of a common theme throughout what we're talking about here is that there's a lot of these like red flags that can pop up here and there, but none of them are say definitively like, oh, this source is corrupt, or this study is corrupt, or this person is corrupt. Right? It's important to look at everything and just analyze it for yourself. Um, One of the tools that I find myself using a lot, especially when I see a website that I have not heard of, is mediabiasfactcheck.com. A lot of news organizations and other publications use this as a resource, but it basically ranks every website based on what the sort of political narrative that they tend to push on their website, whether it's by selective publishing or emotionally loaded headlines, things like that. And they also look at the factual basis that these websites tend to have. So they'll look at a list of recent claims that a website has made, and just run a fact check on a bunch of them, and then give it like a scale from really bad to really good. And so it's always interesting kind of seeing I highly encourage everyone to go to that website and look up some of their favorite sites and see how they might differ in terms of factual reporting, in terms of left versus right. They have a lot of good resources about a lot of the television media as well. And interestingly enough, the print media of a lot of these same publications tends to be a little bit more fact checked. They're not relying on gluing people's eyes to the TV and that sort of thing, at least not quite as much. Um, so that's a good source. And then I also found some tips online about, just not trusting things that, claims of expertise that people make online at face value, always looking for details. So we have sort of this example that was brought up where it says, this person who wrote this article, there's like a bio you might see at the top of it. This person is a serial entrepreneur as well as an investor and owner of a diversified portfolio of innovative digital companies. He's a consultant and well regarded expert in the field of technology. And the interesting thing about this quote, this is something that, might fool me if I was just browsing the internet and saw that, okay, this person seems like he has some credentials. But when you look more closely, you realize there are really no details about any of these credentials listed here. And this is pretty easily something that someone could just write on at the top of their website, if and there's no way to really like verify it without the details of, which companies and that sort of thing. So it's important to remember that even people who are generally pretty critical and pretty logical can also be fooled by a lot of these like really official looking, like for example the National Vaccine Information Center is another one where the website is made to look like an official kind of like government agency or whatever, but it's totally not. It's independent and it pushes a particular narrative and ignores all data that's outside of that narrative, and it's pretty fascinating to see how that works. um, Another source that we looked at is, and this is especially pertinent to the Capitol riots, which is related to QAnon, is sort of these meme pages that become popular and spread all over the internet, and especially on, Facebook and Reddit and a lot of these places. And over the last two election cycles, a lot of these memes that were intended to polarize people and create confusion were traced back to this Russian company um, called the Internet Research Agency, which is not a research agency at all. And basically, their motive was to push like just straight up pro Russian propaganda. And they've been doing this for years. Um, as well as just to kind of weaken the United States over the past two elections by kind of pushing these narratives and these emotional responses. And a lot of times the goal here was, they would target different demographics, including different political ideologies. A few examples that were given, and this is something that was reported by Wired, The Guardian, and New York Times, was that they would often sell the narrative of convincing people not to vote or voting third party, or when they would target the evangelical vote, they would try to, brush off the things that Trump has done that were not in line with religion. They had kind of this like pro Trump, pro Russia agenda, and say what you will about Trump in general, but these are things that have been well documented and well researched, regardless of your opinions on him.
Also,
And
just to
mhm,
interject, the claims about Russia interference were confirmed by a bipartisan Senate committee, mainly headed by Republicans. So this isn't some sort of like excuse me, left wing sort of conspiracy theory about Russian interference. This is something that, like Elias said, has been documented and pretty well established at this point.
yeah, and it's important to remember that, and to not, automatically assume that whatever information is out there that contradicts your narrative must be coming from, someone who disagrees or whatever. But it's interesting how many people don't actually know that fact that you brought up. But that just goes to show the extent of echo chambers online. But yeah, and if you're interested in learning sort of more about this misinformation campaign that was really huge, the documentary Social Dilemma is a super interesting one to watch. I know it kind of went viral last year. A lot of people were canceling their Facebook accounts after they watched it. And normally I don't recommend documentaries too much because it's harder to fact check them. There's more emotional manipulation that goes on a lot of the time compared to like articles. But this one was particularly well done and very much backed up by scientific and journalistic research. Sort of getting into our solutions based on these things, there's also actions that social media sites can take to, be more vigilant about tracking down troll accounts and things like that. I wouldn't necessarily want them to editorialize everything. Obviously, I don't think anyone wants that. But in the case of the Russian troll farm Internet Research Agency, they did end up taking down hundreds of accounts in 2018 after they were pressured to do so, and after the damage had already been done to quite an extent. Um, but this is a pretty easy thing to do, checking if certain pages are verified with ID and things like that, looking at to see if, there's dozens of accounts coming from one area. Of course, they could use VPNs, but there's definitely ways to track that as evidenced by the fact that they did so after they were pressured. And if it's too costly for social media companies, for some of them, then another option could be, one thing that I've been hoping is that maybe more companies will spring up that are set up to exclusively handle looking at who's coming from a troll farm and who's not, and that way this work could sort of be outsourced to those companies, and that way everyone could sort of take advantage of that. But regardless of how exactly we accomplish this, we need a very tough approach on these troll farms, because they're not just misinforming a few people and making them believe a couple crazy things. They're impacting elections, they're undermining our elections, and they're undermining our trust in our institutions, which we rely on for almost everything, for proper information, for proper research. So it's very important that we do something about that in particular.
Another thing that you want to look out for, and another source of misinformation, can be from news organizations. And what you want to look for there is, or one of the things that you want to look for there, aside from their financial investors and that sort of thing, is understanding what ideology they're attempting to appeal to, what demographic they're attempting to appeal to. So, for example, after the 2020 election, at least in right wing media circles, you started to see many people jump ship from Fox News, which traditionally was sort of the news outlet for right wing media, as they started to accept the claims, the reality of the 2020 election. In the media landscape, you saw the rise of organizations like OAN and Newsmax, which, you know, tend to report stories that are misleading or false. And the purpose of them doing that is to capitalize on the audience wants to hear that. The people who, still at this point don't believe that the election was legitimate, or that Joe Biden is a illegitimate president, so on and so forth. Things that don't necessarily have a basis in reality. So understanding what audience a news organization is attempting to capture and exploit, frankly, because if they're spreading misinformation just because those people want to hear it, then it creates sort of these radicalized circles where you have swaths of the population that don't believe things that are necessarily true. So you always want to understand the source of the information, their financial interests, whether that be who provides them funding or what demographic they're attempting to appeal to. And then another way to sort of stay vigilant about information, just making sure that you have a correct assessment of reality, is always updating your opinion with the most recent and best research. You want to read from a wide variety of reputable sources, and also be aware of your own biases, because part of what makes information so easily spread and what makes people so susceptible to misinformation is the cognitive bias and the psychological aspect of misinformation and how it spreads and gets cemented. So, what you want to be aware of is how this can affect your information processing. So, I'm referring to two different articles here, one from Psychology Today about climate denialism, and then a Snopes article about the psychology of COVID denialism. So, part of what makes something like denying the reality of climate change such a insurmountable issue partly has to do with the fact that climate science is not intuitive to the way that the human mind tends to work. We're not necessarily programmed to understand statistical analyses or models that represent the evidence of climate science, and that's part of it, but that's not the full picture. Part of the fuller picture has to do with denial as a primitive defense mechanism to shield us from things that stress us out or cause us anxiety. And climate change is a really good example of something that does that. Not only are the consequences of climate change apocalyptic in nature, as we look at, what it means for our species in the coming decades, but also just in terms of whatever action we have to take against climate change is stressful. It involves mobilizing us in ways, changing the way our economy functions, massive shifts probably to our personal lives, increasing taxes probably to fund infrastructure projects, so on and so forth. And a lot of this seems overwhelming. So, at some level, part of what motivates the denialism of climate change is the fear associated with it. And so, what the article recommends, which I think is a really great idea, is encouraging small changes when applicable, right? So, for example, it's a lot you're gonna have a better chance of encouraging change from somebody, for instance, rather than telling them, you should only eat, vegan food because, eating meat contributes to, carbon output and carbon increases climate change. Encouraging people to just reduce their meat intake or engage in, like, a meatless Monday. Not only does this have, a small material benefit, which obviously is nothing in comparison to the large structural and institutional change that needs to happen for us to address this problem, but it allows people to exercise some power over what makes them fearful, by doing X thing that minorly inconveniences me or doesn't inconvenience me at all. I am acknowledging what might have been scaring me in the first place, which might have been motivating part of my denialism. And also, what this does is it creates the potential for movements where people are psychologically primed for larger organizing. So, if Elias and I have some agreement where, once a week or a couple times a week, we both agree, like, hey, we're going to go ahead and walk to work or we're going to bike to work instead of driving to work. That creates networks for us to be able to engage in larger grassroots organization, which is what will be necessary in order to enact, larger structural change. Because obviously, like, that's the goal with something like climate change. Don't misinterpret what I'm saying here as like, we can all do our little part and then, juke climate change. That's not necessarily what I'm saying. What I am saying is that encouraging small change does allows an opportunity for larger movements to occur.
Yeah, that's a really cool idea, especially the group thing. Like, I like anything that kind of gets people involved because I think that a huge problem nowadays is just like the doomer mentality of like, oh, like the system is so much bigger than us and there's nothing we can do. I think that starting small and then feeling like you're involved, feeling like you're doing something can have like a snowball effect, like you said, and get people uh, primed for larger organizing. And then, that's kind of what we're trying to do on this podcast ultimately is try to figure out ways that each of us can do something to help whatever issue is on our minds and then, gets us all more informed, more involved, and hopefully makes the world a better place.
Absolutely. And again, I really want to stress that the best change for climate change has to come from structural change, but a great way to get there is by doing your little part in the here and now. Another thing that motivates, certain denying certain things that have substantial or, conclusive evidence associated with it are in-group mentalities and how we prefer our own groups, right? And this is something that applies to everybody because everybody, especially those who, have opinions on these matters, are a part of an ideological group. And in order to be a part of that ideological group, you have to believe certain things about the world, in order to be part of that, right? In order to be, a leftist, you have to believe certain things about the world. In order to be a conservative, you have to believe certain things. about the world. And so when these beliefs about the world as we interpret them are challenged, it can oftentimes become personal, and interpret it as personal and don't engage with the evidence in a total unbiased way. So there was a 2015 meta-analysis published in the Sage Journal that looked at people's opinions when it came to climate change, and analyzed and took into account their politics as well as their knowledge about political science, energy policy, what have you. And what they found was that those that are more polarized, conservatives, even those that were ranked the highest levels in cognitive sophistication and quantitative reasoning skills, were more likely to believe climate conspiracies. Similarly, liberals that were presented hypothetical consensuses about nuclear waste management also disregarded that evidence to kind of hold on to their own belief. So what you have is, especially, in our modern political landscape, people who are polarized and on one side of the issue in their group are not able to contend with the evidence, even when those people are smart. So something that I kind of want to stress with this point is that it's not just people not being smart or not being willing to understand, right? Like I feel like a lot of times people are really dismissive and really misanthropic about how like, oh, these people don't believe that masks are effective, they must all be stupid. That's not necessarily the case. Some of these people are, integrated members of society who have high demanding jobs, that require a high level of cognitive function. I mean, even in flat earth circles you see that kind of thing. And what it is a preference to sort of in-group psychology. And the idea of, once my worldview is challenged, it then becomes personal. So for example, if political leaders of a certain faction and partisan media are telling the populace like COVID is overblown, versus the scientific experts that are saying no, it's not, if somebody already believes the former, then they think that the latter is an attack on their identity.
So the in-group preferences thing is kind of a tough issue to solve because it's something that is kind of ingrained in all of us, right? It's kind of a just a like a biological social habit that we all have. But one way we can attempt to counteract that in our own sort of discussions with people is, we're all going to have disagreements. And one of the key things to do, in my opinion, is just to not be combative with the other person and to understand their thoughts, understand their beliefs. This is a good, it's kind of twofold. One, this is a good, like, if you're looking at it in a sort of a Machiavellian sense, it's a good tactic to like get people on your side. But then like the better reason to do it is because it helps us all grow. You might learn something from someone who you thought was crazy, and they'll learn a little bit about your perspective. Sort of the whole marketplace of ideas thing, which is its own bag of worms. But for the purpose of this argument, it is something that that I have seen be effective, at least in personal conversations. If you see someone who is presenting, info from some sort of source that's biased, or you've looked at it and it appears that, they're using false information, then, it's usually not a great idea to just like, well, depending on who you're talking to, you can kind of judge it for yourself. But usually not a great idea to just like attack the info or attack the source of the information, but rather to look at it in more of a positive light and recommend a different source if you have something that's genuinely better, and kind of point them in that direction and say, okay, what do you think about this? I was having a conversation with one of my buddies the other day on Facebook about sort of the minimum wage, and it was something that we both kind of had agreements and disagreements on, because I have a little bit more of a centristy position on it. But it was cool. I mean, he shared his articles, I shared my articles. We sort of like commented on both of them and read them, and didn't really continue the conversation for too long. But like, I feel like I learned something, and I'm hoping that he felt like he learned something. And then just, like we said before, always looking for evidence that contradicts your beliefs. If you believe something, don't, like, if you believe, for example, minimum wage is a good idea, don't do a Google search for here's why minimum wage is a good idea. Look for why it's a bad idea, and look for what the counter arguments are that you might have not have heard before. And it gets difficult with more emotionally loaded topics, war, poverty, crime, that sort of thing. But we have to remember that when we're looking at policy, when we're looking at action, a lot of these solutions are going to be fact driven, and we have to know what the facts are in order to even start the conversation. And then, still within the topic of, like, we're trying to figure out how misinformation spreads so deeply on the internet. And obviously, we can't really have this discussion without also talking about the algorithms of social media, which kind of harkens back to the profit motives that we've seen throughout all media throughout history, really, which is that generally they're trying to maintain your attention, because ad-based business models depend on you being active on a particular website or on a particular news network for a certain amount of time so that they can present you with more ads. And especially nowadays, those ads are personalized. And so there's privacy implications there, which of course has been, pretty well researched and talked about. But of course, above it all, this has wide implications for the spread of false information. And so in 2016, we had a study that studied 3,000 Americans leading up to the 2016 election and found that Facebook referred people to false news 15% of the time out of all the articles that were shared. And so it was kind of, in that study, it was documented as the main perpetrator of false information in 2016. And so these algorithms lead to echo chambers, of course, because they tell you exactly what you want to hear. And so, this includes YouTube with its related video algorithm, but also pretty much any modern social network. Always, and this is harkening back to the social dilemma documentary I was talking about, which sort of introduced me to this topic. It goes over sort of just how the social media sites have a profit motive to, keep you watching. And they do that by showing you stuff that's similar to what you've already seen. And so, of course, these echo chambers develop, and it's a huge problem. And the reason it's a huge problem, as we said earlier, false information kind of fits in with these echo chambers because it's easier if you're making something up to fit a specific narrative. It's more exciting for people who are into that narrative. And especially because these types of people who are inside these ideologies are going to be less critical, less likely to fact check than people who are less politically involved, or have more moderate beliefs or things like that, or don't use social media very often, and so don't get spied on to show them what social media sites think that they might like. So this is a huge problem, and there are a lot of potential solutions to this problem, which we'll sort of go over one by one. Part of it has to do with the way social media sites operate. So, the most basic thing that we could say is that social media sites, because they have the freedom to moderate however they want, we can always pressure them to be better about moderating false information. So we've already kind of improved with the fact that, Twitter regularly adds fact checks to certain tweets that contain false information. And once again, verifiably false information where you can click through and see the reasoning that they're using. But we've had companies take the charge on this after being pressured to do so from the last two election cycles. But of course, they could always be doing more. But the sort of the bigger issue at hand here is, well, that tendency to fact check sort of goes against the business model that I just described. False information is very profitable because, like I said, it keeps your eyes glued. And so some of the solutions relating to that get a little trickier because essentially the ideal solution would be to get rid of ads and move social media sites towards a subscription model. I don't think a subscription model social media site would have as many willing consumers. Economic theory would say that if a subscription model was as viable as an ad-based model, then you would see some of those competitors springing up that are using the subscription model. And so that alone kind of tells me that it's possible that if If there was some sort of if there was a major public pressure to, not have ad-based social media sites, or if everyone started boycotting the ad-based media sites, or even just the, personally targeted, privacy invasive ad-based social media sites. Assuming that movement was successful, I don't think there'd be a way for those companies to really recoup the costs of that. And I'm personally okay with that. They already make a ton of money. And so they would probably end up doing fine in the end, but they certainly wouldn't be as profitable as they currently are. And so that's basically why there would be kind of a pushback if, there'd be a large pushback if we had a movement around that. Now, we can't really do this legislatively because one thing I actually looked up recently is, as an attempt to find a compromise with this solution, is taxing internet ads, taxing digital advertising in general, to essentially dissuade people from using that as their business model. And I read an interesting Forbes article that kind of listed out the First Amendment problems with this, and that idea just sort of seems dead in the water. It also violates the Permanent Internet Tax Freedom Act. And so there's just a lot of sort of like regulations and huge laws we have in place against like any sort of legislation that tells websites what they can and cannot publish, essentially. And we're going to be getting into that even more when we get into the Section 230 area, which is going to be super interesting. The other thing to think about, some tech people have been advocating that we move to decentralized and open source social networks. And so, sort of the idea behind this is that instead of going to facebook.com and signing up for an account there, basically you would sign up for a particular, they call them instances, but these are basically servers that host websites. You'd sign up for a particular instance of a social media site. The most popular one right now is Mastodon, which is very similar to Twitter, and there'd be tons of these instances that talk to each other, basically. So you sign up for your instance, and your friend might sign up for the same one or a different one. And either way, you'd both be able to see each other's posts and follow each other and talk to each other. It's sort of the same idea of like blockchain and a lot of these like other like federated web ideas, where it's very much against the idea of like a top-down single ownership of a particular website. It's kind of, you can make your own app if you want to, and then that app, as long as it uses the same network protocol, can interact with any other app. And so this is nice because it sort of, it eases both the fears that some people on one side have of like, misinformation getting out there, and the, sort of the other side, which is overbearing moderation. It's essentially puts the user back in control because there's not going to be any algorithms that manipulate them. You only follow the people you want to follow. And this is a fantastic idea in theory. Right now, it doesn't appear super economically viable because, even worse than sort of the subscription model idea, with a decentralized platform, you basically, any app that uses, these algorithms that are privacy invasive and spy on you and things like that, one, you'd be able to look at the code because most likely all of these would be open source. And two, anyone that was sort of caught doing this, there'd be no reason to stay on their platform because you could just as easily go to a different one that doesn't do any of that, right? And it sort of just like goes against how the entire system works to even have like privacy invasive algorithms and things like that. And so it's a cool idea, and I look forward to potentially one day this being profitable. We could actually bring a subscription model to this if you wanted to pay for a particular, high density server. But there's a lot of potential avenues to go down as far as the decentralized model. But I figured I'd throw the idea out there, even though it might not be totally ready. There's websites that you can sign up for to kind of try it out. We'll list those in the show notes. And I think it's a pretty interesting idea for, for the future, possibly near future, possibly far future. And then lastly, about social media, regardless of whether we go through a decentralized model or a subscription model or whatever, I think any platform that moderates its content, um, and this is something that I saw brought up in one of the articles by EFF, Electronic Frontier Foundation, sort of proposed this, is that if social media site bans someone, it should be fully transparent. It should be available for everyone to see so that you can see if there's any sort of bias going on. And this gives consumers more of a choice about which social media sites they want to support. It lets them make that decision based on their own viewing of things. So we've listed out a ton of problems with social media, some potential solutions, and sort of at the heart of a lot of this is a bill that was passed into law in 1996, part of the Communications Decency Act, this particular section of it was called Section 230. And so, yeah, we're going to sort of dig into what Section 230 is and how we feel it should be, approached going forward.
So Section 230 basically protects platforms from liability and doesn't hold them responsible for what users post or share on that platform. So it protects people in a variety of ways. So if I forward an email or I share a Facebook story that is, misinformation or could be, found to be defamatory, Facebook is not held responsible for that, and neither am I. Only the publisher is held responsible for spreading that misinformation. And Section 230 also encourages platforms to engage in good faith moderation to ensure that hate speech, misinformation, and that sort of thing are not being spread on their platforms. Section 230 is a very contentious piece of legislation. People on the right wing tend to believe that Section 230 bans right wing speakers and conservatives. People who are more left leaning think that Section 230 lets companies off the hook for spreading hateful and misinformation, that sort of thing. A lot of politicians, successfully and unsuccessfully, have proposed amendments to it or threatened to remove it outright. This could be successful in mitigating misinformation. It would leave many websites completely in the dust and have a devastating impact on our ability to freely share information. A lot of how our internet landscape looks today is in part of Section 230 and how it allows certain people to engage in content. One of the amendments that was passed in 2018 was the Stop Enabling Sex Traffickers Act and Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act, FOSTA and SESTA, which held platforms liable if it was determined that the platform was facilitating prostitution or sex crimes or any sort of abuse like that. However, one of the big issues with this law was the broad language of the bill, which included those who were either providing support for victims of child abuse or were advocating for victims of sexual assault and that sort of thing. So part of the issue with any sort of amendment to 230, as I see it, is that the language has to be pretty specific. Otherwise, unintentionally, we're gonna hurt people who are actually trying to do good. And I think the passing of the FOSTA SESTA uh, is a good example of that. Like good intention, but having negative consequences for the people who are already trying to fight that online.
Yeah, and the implications of this were pretty wide. Like a lot of people are speculating that this is sort of why Tumblr infamously took down all their sexual content, is just because like pretty much anything involving sex whatsoever was seen as like, oh, this could potentially violate this law, and then we could be held accountable and that sort of thing. It wasn't confirmed that that was the reason why, but that's been sort of speculated by a lot of people. So yeah, FOSTA SESTA, and as we'll see, most of the amendments that have been proposed and signed into law of Section 230 have been widely criticized by technology enthusiasts and free speech advocates. So, sort of the next big one that made the news earlier last year was the Earn It Act. This was a bill sponsored by Lindsey Graham. It was a bipartisan bill that thankfully hasn't made its way into being an actual law. But essentially, what this law aimed to do was force companies to work with law enforcement as far as like, we believe that some criminal activity took place. Send us all of the Facebook messages from this person and that sort of thing. And companies would have basically been forced to comply with the law and hand over any user information that was needed to crack whatever case. And this also included, perhaps most controversially, any social network that uses end to end encryption. So, end to end encryption, for those of you who don't know, essentially makes it so that whoever is hosting the data can't see your messages. So, like WhatsApp would be the best example of this, even though WhatsApp does store a lot of information. Probably a better example nowadays would be Signal, where basically you send a message to other people. It goes through an encryption algorithm so that in their database, it just looks like a bunch of scrambled characters, and then it's able to be decrypted on the other end. And so the big criticism of the Earn It Act, one of the big criticisms, was that essentially it forces any social media company or any messaging app to have to break encryption because they basically have no choice but to hand over whatever messages to law enforcement. So there has to be a backdoor into that encryption somewhere. Privacy and the ability to encrypt your messages is not just important for people who want to engage in criminal activity or whatever. It's kind of an important fundamental technology, right, for a number of reasons. So, one is, of course, protection against hackers. Even big companies with huge security teams are getting hacked every now and then. And if hackers obtain, even if Google doesn't necessarily care about, where you were walking your dog the other day, there could be people out there who use that information maliciously to learn information about you, to spy on you, and all sorts of nefarious things. Businesses care a lot about being able to encrypt their data because they have business secrets that don't want to get out. This law would essentially be terrible for them as well. And then, of course, the sort of the almost obvious thing at this point, but still need to be reminded of, is that the government can be corrupted and often is to if law enforcement needs access to particular data, you don't necessarily know what they want to use that for, and that could have a lot of really scary implications. Probably the most damning example of this that took place last year was this man in Florida who was accused of robbery because he had his Google location services on while he was on a bike ride. And essentially, Google handed over his location data to law enforcement because they were trying to figure out, who robbed a particular place. And that just happened to be on his path. And so, if it wasn't for his lawyer essentially proving his case that he was innocent, we don't know how that would have turned out. And I'd imagine that would be very scary for anyone going through that and having to defend themselves in that case. So the ability to have information on your phone, on whatever device, shared with other people, and but still private, so only you have access to it, is a very important right for a number of reasons. And the Earn It Act would have completely taken that away. And so that's just one example of a 230 amendment that could have caused a lot of problems with regards to user privacy. And that's sort of a pattern we've seen with a lot of these 230 amendments. But then the next one that we wanted to talk about was a more recent proposition. This was proposed, I think, just a few months ago, actually. It's called the Protecting Americans from Dangerous Algorithms Act. And this might be probably the least problematic 230 amendment I've seen. I don't know. Would you agree with that, Grant?
Yeah, from what we've talked about here, it seems like obviously we don't know what it would look like once it's enacted because that's kind of a different story, right? Looking
Hmm.
at like intention versus like actual reality once it's implemented. But from the wording of it, it doesn't seem as terrible as the Earn It Act for sure.
Definitely. um, but basically, what this act was in the title, we have protecting Americans from dangerous algorithms. And so the idea is, well, I'll just read the sort of the quote. If platforms use an algorithm, model, or computational process to rank, order, promote, recommend, or amplify user provided content, the bill would remove 230's protection in suits seeking to hold platforms responsible for acts of terrorism or failures to prevent violations of civil rights. So, in summary, essentially, if you use an algorithm to to sort content to show people more of what they want to see or show people certain things based on their political background, based on whatever advertiser friendly topic they want, then that they basically lose their 230 protections, and Facebook gets treated as a publisher of all the content that it hosts. Now, I don't know if entirely, this is something we talked about for a little bit. We're not sure if removing the 230 protections entirely is warranted, and there's been a lot of sort of pushback against that. But this is one area where it might be reasonable to at least, fine companies for, knowingly pushing misinformation, or just for even, using these algorithms, which can be useful if you want to find more related videos, but, often has massive side effects, the alt-right pipeline, which we've all heard of at this point, and that sort of thing. So, so I don't know about this one. I'm still sort of on the fence about it, as someone who likes, freedom of speech, the ability for internet companies to sort of manage their things how they want. I have my doubts and skepticism, but I do like the way that they're tackling this issue, because I do think, as we've discussed, the algorithms are really kind of at the heart of a lot of this.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think that even I think removing 230 protections entirely is pretty harsh and might have some negative consequences. But I think that at the heart of that, recognizing that algorithms that does seem to be kind of the big issue, especially with like misinformation as it pertains to Facebook and other social media. So I think our approach to 230 should be that we should understand that 230 does a lot of good, right? It protects platforms from being held liable for everything said on their platform, right? Facebook doesn't have to go to court over every defamatory statement made by one of its many users, right? That it becomes like a legal nightmare for any platform that wants to host user content, and basically makes it impossible for us to have any sort of like social media or platform where I can say what I want to say and Elias can say what he wants to say. So at the basis, I think both Elias and I agree that Section 230 is pretty good. However, there are certain problems, and there should be some way to address the algorithm problems where companies benefit from creating and sort of facilitating content that either spreads misinformation or hate speech or anything like that. So trying to balance that is a good idea, but on the whole, I think Elias and I both agree that 230 is a net good for our internet landscape.
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, it's called the backbone of the internet for a good reason. It enables pretty much every website we use today to exist, because we can post the things that we want, and we're the ones who are held liable for them. And doesn't go so far as to make everything a public forum where everything's allowed, but I think having those moderation capabilities is a kind of a perfect balance there. And I
Yeah.
wish that more people sort of outside of the tech world understood sort of the weight of 230. We've had both Biden and Trump talking about, like, repealing it and amending it and all these sort of things. And I think that there's often not enough attention paid to just how important it is for the things that we do. And not to say that there couldn't be a better internet with some other sort of law in place, but for now, I haven't seen anyone propose like a better solution that remains everything intact. But, we'll see what the future holds.
Absolutely. And yeah, without Section 230, nobody would want to make a Facebook or a Twitter or anything, because
Yeah.
then they would be legally responsible. And so you wouldn't have any sort of social media platform to sort of organize and advocate, which a lot of people want to use social media for, aside from, just posting pictures of their friends and stuff. Alrighty, so that just about wraps up our episode today. In terms of the solutions, it's kind of a wide net of things, both on a legislative front and what you can do in your own personal life. So, when it comes to your personal life, when you're engaging with content, you always want to be a critical thinker. You always want to look at who's funding the studies. You can use websites like mediabiasfactcheck.com to see sort of the reputability and the history of certain organizations. Um, on the legislative front, we can advocate for more funding and power to regulatory bodies like the EPA, so that way they can crack down on private firms which engage in spreading misinformation to protect their bottom line, and also holding corporations accountable by imposing fines for any behavior like this. And if it can be determined that they knowingly spread misinformation that led to material harms, obviously on a case by case basis, um, to advocate for criminal penalties in that regard. Elias went over the business side of things and how the future of social media might look different from sort of what Facebook offers, sort of more decentralized options and subscription based options. Also, we should advocate to hold corporations accountable by imposing fines on any kind of behavior where they engage in misinformation propagation, and if there are grounds to do so, hold them criminally liable.
Yeah, and that kind of includes social media sites as well, as far as being vigilant about tracking down these troll accounts that come from random places that aren't verified, and making sure that they're using their algorithms in ways that don't perpetuate so much false information. Kind of a tough hill to climb, but I think that it's absolutely necessary for going forward.
Yeah, and when you're engaging with, different opinions and sort of in like the marketplace of ideas. I know it's kind of a bit of a meme, but when you are engaging with people, because things are so polarized, you should be aware of your own cognitive biases and how they infect your information processing. Also, being aware of how denialism plays a role in people just not accepting certain facts. And so, what you want to do whenever somebody is doing that in light of something like climate change, where it's sort of a defense mechanism, is encourage small change that is easy for them to engage with. So that way, they're at least able to, one, have a very small positive effect, but more importantly, be able to actually address that issue in some capacity, hopefully leading to a snowball of larger, more positive change.
Definitely.
You're also going to want to look at evidence that contradicts your beliefs. Obviously, you want to go with things that are reputable sources and whatnot, but don't be opposed to having your beliefs challenged. Try to engage in good faith when you can with people who disagree with you.
So, in addition to that, and we're probably going to pick one of these as our, you know, fundraiser that we do every episode, but donating to and just in general supporting fact checking organizations, because as we've said, they have the least incentive to lie about these things, and they can, as we've seen, especially the past 4 years, but even before that, they are absolutely essential to making sure that we can properly separate truth from falsehoods and misinformation from what's actually existing in the world. So with that, looks like we've got a lot of solutions out there that we can kind of like carry through to our lives, things that we can talk about with other people, things that we can support, ways to critically think, as well as some legislative ideas and some ideas that social media sites can enact.
Thank you guys for listening. We really appreciate it. As always, let us know your thoughts on the Facebook, the Instagram, the Reddit, the Discord, which Elias has made. I'm told we're getting a bot that's going to be pretty cool soon. I'm
Yep.
kind of a old man, so I don't really know what that means, but I'm super excited. And as always, we're going to have our article on medium.com/solutions where you can read up on the sources that we used for this episode. We really want to encourage interaction with you guys and being able to sort of create like a collaborative process here.
Yes, because if we said anything wrong, we want you to fact check us.
Yeah, we don't wanna be the misinformation, you know?